Hello. By the time Luther left the Wartburg castle, his ideas were spreading rapidly. Like the sorcerer's apprentice who conjures up forces he has no means of controlling, Luther lived to see events unfolding in ways he neither approved nor predicted. While he played a less active role in events, his beliefs that every man was his own priest and that Christians were free by being justified through their faith in Jesus Christ were taken very literally by some and led to unintended consequences that shocked the conservative Luther. What strikes one is how rapidly events took place. Even before Luther was summoned to appear before the Diet of Worms in 1521, protests against the church were underway throughout Germany, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. Indeed, it seemed that Luther had dropped a match and the forest was beginning to burn. A good number of those protests belonged to what historians now call the Radical Reformation, which rejected secular control of religion and was so named to distinguish it from the magisterial Reformation associated with Luther and others who argued that church and state were interdependent and that the latter could be used to enforce law and order and to eradicate heresy. Most radical and disturbing to the conservative opinion at the time were the Anabaptists, who believed that those baptized as infants needed to be baptized again as adults when they were aware of what was happening to them, in what was termed a believer's baptism, hence the term Anabaptism, Greek for rebaptism. Because Anabaptists tended to refuse military service and sought to separate themselves from mainstream society, establishing utopian communities wherein a kind of primitive communism was practiced, with property being held in common, they were universally despised and persecuted as a result. Their refusal to cooperate with the secular state led to their being declared anathema, and being an Anabaptist was made a capital offence throughout the Holy Roman Empire in 1529, with many leading Anabaptists meeting with violent deaths. Now, whilst the majority of Anabaptists were peace-loving separatists who wanted to be left alone in order to prepare for the second coming of Christ, which they believed was imminent, a tiny minority could be said to have brought persecution upon themselves, such as those, for example, who took control of the northern German city of Munster in 1534. Led by one John of Leyden, who claimed to be the biblical King David's successor, they sought to establish a new Zion. Anyone who objected could leave, but those who remained were put to death, Lutherans and Catholics alike being hacked to pieces in the town square. Because Abraham had more than one wife, polygamy was legalized. John himself taking 16 wives, one of whom, according to one account, was beheaded for challenging his authority during a famine in which the poor starved, while John and his court lived in the lap of luxury. Now, if this account is true, and I must point out that it was written by those who wanted to justify their savage treatment of the Anabaptists of Munster, then I take my hat off to the lady and consider her one of the unsung heroines of European history. But John did not stop at polygamy. Private property and money were also abolished, and all books except the Bible were burned. This great bacchanalia of violence and sexual license was ended after a prolonged siege of Munster, in which both Catholics and Lutherans participated, a rare moment of confessional cooperation during the Reformation. As the city fell, more savage violence ensued as the city was sacked by its conquerors. John and other Anabaptist leaders had spiked collars placed around their necks and then were attached to poles, while men with red-hot thongs proceeded to rip their flesh, an agonizing process that took an hour to complete. At which point, those subjected to such unimaginable horrors had their tongues ripped out by pincers and their hearts pierced with burning daggers, which mercifully brought their sufferings to an end. After Munster, Anabaptists were viewed with even greater suspicion and disgust than before. But they were not alone in responding to Luther in ways that he had not anticipated. Some took his on Christian liberty very literally indeed, claiming that the liberty of which Luther spoke meant that, because they were justified through their faith in Jesus Christ, men were no longer obligated to obey the moral or civil law, a belief known as antinomianism, and that peasants could free themselves from their feudal masters. The liberty whereof Luther spoke was the freedom we all enjoy as a result of God's forgiveness. So when peasants throughout the Holy Roman Empire rebelled against their masters in 1524, he condemned them in no uncertain terms, urging the authorities to kill them without reservation as if they were dogs made mad by rabies. Although Luther was troubled by the savagery with which these peasant rebellions were crushed, he nevertheless greatly feared the consequences of men interpreting Scripture for themselves and placing interpretations on his own writings that he had not intended they possess. Socially conservative, Luther would have no truck with revolution against the established order, and that waged by German peasants against their masters constituted the largest such insurrection until the French Revolution in the late 18th century. Thus it was that Luther agreed to the Augsburg Confession of 1530, a formal declaration of Lutheran theology, sanctioning a married clergy, justification through faith alone, and communion in two kinds, among much else. By this time, Lutheranism had experienced rapid growth. Besides the Holy Roman Empire, where about half the princes embraced it, it also spread to Scandinavia, that is Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, in which countries it was imposed from above by the individual kings. That this happened just a decade after the indulgence controversy is remarkable and speaks to the attractions of Luther's teachings. By appealing to German patriotism and xenophobic resentment of the largely Italian papacy, and by supporting the established political order, he won the support of the rich and powerful. Otherwise, he was unlikely to have survived. Furthermore, his doctrine of the priesthood of all believers, suggesting an unprecedented level of personal autonomy, appealed to many. As regards Luther himself, by 1530 he had left the Augustinian order, married an ex-nun, Katharina von Bora, who was 16 years his junior, with whom he fathered 6 children. He died in 1546 in his bed, surrounded by his loving family, in Eisleben, the town where he was born, and was buried in Wittenberg, appropriately enough, where he had made his name. Now, despite the rapid spread of Lutheranism throughout Germany and Scandinavia, Holy Roman Emperor Charles had not stood idly by. But this noble Catholic prince, who saw himself as a second Charlemagne, was beset from all sides, especially during the crucial decade of the 1520s. Not only did he have to defend his lands in Central and Eastern Europe from the Muslim Ottoman Turks, but he was also at war with his fellow Catholic monarch, Francis I of France, in a struggle known as the Habsburg-Valois Wars, for European supremacy. He defeated Francis and took him prisoner at the Battle of Pavia in 1525, but the Turks defeated the Hungarians the following year in the Battle of Mohacs, thereby incorporating Hungary into the Ottoman Empire. By the time Charles was able to devote all of his resources to stemming the Protestant tide, it was probably too late to make much of a difference. This was brought to sharp relief in 1529 at the Diet of Speyer, where the attending Lutheran princes formally protested his authority in matters of religion, becoming known thereafter as Protestants. Perhaps inevitably, this led to a series of wars fought within the Holy Roman Empire between Catholic princes loyal to Charles and Protestant princes who opposed him. I will have more to say about these wars at a later stage, in a later chapter, but suffice it to say for now that they dragged on inconclusively for a quarter of a century, until the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, a stalemate that established the principle known in Latin as cuius regio eius religio, whereby the prince determined the religion of his subjects, either Catholic or Lutheran. Anyone not belonging to either of those faiths was deliberately excluded from this compromise, including Calvinists and Anabaptists. The following year, Charles V, worn down by years of struggle, abdicated, dividing his vast domains between his son Philip, became King of Spain, and his brother Ferdinand, who assumed the title Holy Roman Emperor. Spending his last years in a Spanish monastery, Charles died in 1558, and with him, I believe, died the dream of a reconstituted Christendom. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.